I think going below 20, what was a deeper capitulation than I would have guessed several months ago. It's always hard to say if you're at the ultimate bottom or not. We've had a lot of forced selling. I mean, generally you want to be a buyer during forced selling.
Can you explain what you mean by capitulation?
So a bottoming can be a process. But yeah, I would describe capitulation as kind of this like explosive moment of forced selling. And so if you look at small users, people that own, maybe one Bitcoin or half a Bitcoin or two or three Bitcoin, a lot of those have actually taken their coins off exchanges and held them in a hardware wallet.
What do you feel more, what kind of time frame you're more confident about? Is it 12 to 18 months, 2 years, 3 years?
If I were to look back 3 to 5 years from now,
All right, guys, hello and welcome to this special video here. We're joined with economist and analyst, one of my favorite analysts, Lynn Alden of lynnalden.com. Lynn Alden, her main specialty is analyzing, again, crypto markets, also the economy and indeed cycles, and also the stock markets. In fact, is it correct, Lynn, that your main specialty, other than looking at the fundamentals of Bitcoin, is value stocks? Is that mostly what you focus on?
yeah, but I guess my mix is macro in general.
Macro.
So what's happened with global money systems, and that includes the dollar, that includes gold, that includes energy, that includes Bitcoin, crypto. And then
Mhm.
yeah, I also focus pretty significantly on value stocks.
So in this video, guys, I want to ask Lynn her view about the current situation in Bitcoin and the overall market. There's a lot of confusion going on out there, and I think you're by far one of the best people to talk to about this. So join us. Okay, so guys, welcome back. Lynn, so here's the question. Well, first of all, we had this 75, 73, 75%. We've had this major crash in the price of Bitcoin so far from its all-time highs down to 20,000. My question is, first of all, did the extent of this move, did any of this surprise you in any way? What lessons people can learn from as well? And I will come back to this. I guess the second part of this question is, where do you think we're heading over the next 6 to 12 months? Do you see some light at the end of the tunnel here, or maybe not?
So to answer your first question, I think the last 10,000 move was somewhat surprising to me. I think that was below
Mhm.
my base case. I would not have been surprised to see us go below 30. I think going below 20, what was a deeper capitulation than I would have guessed several months ago.
Mhm.
And for people who've been following my work, generally, Bitcoin and cryptos do well in rising PMI environments. So Purchasing Managers Index, economic acceleration, they usually do well in that kind of environment. And then they usually do poorly or sideways in declining PMI environments, economic contraction type of environments. And those are generally these like 3-year cycles that the global economy goes through, US economy, global economy. And so I had been getting cautious in the tactical sense about the fact that we were going through a declining PMI environment, and then therefore that can put a lot of pressures on Bitcoin, despite the fact that I was say still structurally long-term bullish on it, but then being aware of that kind of downside. And then in particular when Luna started buying Bitcoin, so Luna Foundation Guard, um, I started to kind of write about a potential scenario where they totally implode and they end up having to sell their Bitcoin into a weak market capitulation, and that's unfortunately what we saw in May. Now, the deeper leg that I didn't necessarily expect was the implosion of Three Arrows Capital. So basically, there's more contagion in the space. There's really
Yeah.
kind of a follow-on. It was kind of the second part of that Luna collapse, right? So for example, there's a proprietary trading company, Three Arrows Capital, that they had over 10 billion in capital at their peak, and they were heavily impaired by the Luna implosion. They also had leverage out from multiple different shops. It's pretty opaque leverage, and they use Bitcoin as collateral mostly to trade altcoins. And so they're not like making leverage bets on Bitcoin, but they're using Bitcoin as collateral to go out and buy other things. And they basically just ran into massive issues and got liquidated. And so there's all this kind of forced selling of Bitcoin, total capitulation in cryptos. A number of companies went bankrupt or near bankrupt, had all sorts of liquidity crises. You have a lot of entities that are busy forced selling. And so this is the one, Luna was something that I wrote about and expected and cautioned about, where something more opaque like Three Arrows Capital is kind of the second leg to that. It's just that one's harder to predict. And so I think the environment we're in now is that we've had a pretty deep capitulation. It's always hard to say if you're at the ultimate bottom or not, but this does look a lot like the late 2018 capitulation where Bitcoin, for a while, Bitcoin was kind of stabilizing around 6,000, and then it just out of nowhere got cut in half, all down to almost 3,000 when you had the Fed tightening and you had, problems in credit markets and you had this kind of contagion. And so I think that we've gone through a similar capitulation now where, Bitcoin looked like it was trying to bottom around 30,000, it was kind of that level environment, and then out of nowhere it got just completely capitulated down to sub 20,000. So by most metrics, it's in a pretty deep value zone, right? So it's below the average on-chain cost
Yes.
basis. It touched below the 200-week moving average, which it almost never does. Basically, we've had a lot of forced selling. I mean, generally, you want to be a buyer during forced selling and a trimmer when everyone's
Mm,
euphoric. So I think
mhm.
that if I were to look back 3 to 5 years from now, I would not be surprised. I'd be mostly confident this is probably going to look at a pretty significant buying opportunity in Bitcoin. But I do think that people have to be aware that it might not be over. There could be more pain ahead. I think the macro situation is still kind of going to be struggling for a number of months here, and so I'm not necessarily expecting any sort of explosive recovery anytime soon. But I do think that any interested people might want to look into the space because I think this is a time to consider start laying capital in, or to start maybe building up a position, or at least studying it to see if it's something you eventually want to go into. Because I first bought Bitcoin during the it was April 2020, so we were just coming out of
Yes.
that whole COVID crash, and that was the last time, that was the fourth time ever that Bitcoin was below its on-chain cost basis, um,
Yes.
and now it's the fifth time, and so in many ways it looks like that earlier type of environment, and so I'm pretty optimistic long term on where we are now, while still cautioning that the next 3 to 6 months, anything can really go when you're in this type of weak economic environment with low liquidity.
That's a very good point.
Bitcoin had less of a blow off top in the cycle. Most of the blow off
Mm,
top was in other things like Dogecoin, or some of
yeah.
these like either meme coins or some of the smart contract platforms. Bitcoin itself had more of a rolling top, so I was kind of, as a base case, maybe expecting it not to capitulate as much as it did in some of its prior cycles.
Mm,
That was before the whole Three Arrows Capital implosion. It was kind of the second leg of that divestiture. So basically, given how low sentiment was, and given what was happening with inflation in a number of markets, I was kind of expecting that upper 20s position might hold.
mhm.
Um, I was, the way I was analyzing it with my client was saying that I think this is a reasonable value zone. It's not a deep value zone. It's not a capitulation. And I kind of kept looking back at that 2018 chart and being like, this, you could have a pretty violent. So I wasn't ruling out this kind of final capitulation type of phase,
Yeah.
but wasn't necessarily expecting it either. But now that we've gotten it, I am kind of more confident than I was a number of months ago about kind of recommending that people at least consider looking into layering in, or researching the protocol just to see if it's something that they're interested in. Basically, I think that now we have a pretty severe washout in terms of liquidated leverage, forced sellers. This is the time where I don't mind picking some up and kind of being on the other side of that trade.
Absolutely, I agree. Um, I don't know if you saw this interesting article from Glassnode where they said, and I put that on my video as well, where they basically said that the recent drop below 20K forced a lot of long-term holders to capitulate as well, and they just got out finally. And I think it was one of the biggest realized losses in history, next to 2020 and 2011. I think it said it was the biggest capital outflow in history of Bitcoin. And they also used this word, as you said, capitulation. But I want to go back to that word because some people mistakenly think capitulation means the exact bottom, or I think that's not what you mean at all. And I think capitulation is more of a zone or a region. Can you explain what you mean by capitulation?
I mean, capitulation is basically an explosive type of bottom where you go down to what roughly ends up being kind of a bottoming zone very quickly.
Yeah,
Whether or not that is the precise bottom or not, as I think, not like, as you pointed out, that's not the main question. The question is the worst of it behind us, right? And so obviously we
right.
won't know
Mm,
until years in advance what the actual bottom was. When you have forced selling, when you have bank runs, when you have just basically uncontrolled liquidations, that's the type of event that usually marks a capitulation.
Yeah.
Whereas, when you look back at the 2018 Bitcoin price action, you had that kind of deep capitulation, but it's not as though you got some rapid bounce back. You stayed down there and chopped along sideways for a long period of time. I forget
Yes.
exactly what day the bottom occurred on. And of course, even you recovered and then chopped along, and then a
Yeah.
couple years later during the COVID, you actually kind of went back down briefly to roughly where that bottom was. You kind of very briefly retested that those types of 2018 bottoming zones. So a bottoming can be a process. But I would describe capitulation as kind of this like explosive moment of forced selling. A lot of kind of previously high conviction entities throwing in the towel, sentiment bottoming out, and then kind of being able to at least start the process of reconstruction. Which might not mean the bottom's in, but I think that means that the explosive selling might be behind us. If that's correct. I mean, you can always have. So, for example, there was a capitulation in May, but then there was even a deeper capitulation in June, right? So you had kind of the second shoe to
Yeah.
drop. The contagion of
That's
Luna
correct.
was not isolated to Luna, and it actually impaired 3 Hours Capital, which was another large, basically whale that died in the market, right? So we have to, I think, see if there's another entity out there that might, be affected by this contagion. But I think if there's not, this is the
Hmm.
kind of zone where you'd expect a bottom to occur. Like I said before, this is the fifth time in Bitcoin's, history where it's below average on-chain cost basis. Another thing I found
Yes.
interesting is that because you had so many bank runs and problems with these kind of exchanges, custodial type things, you've actually seen a really sharp uptick in the number of people holding Bitcoin on chain. And so if you look at small users, people that own maybe one Bitcoin or half a Bitcoin or 2 or 3 Bitcoin, a lot of those have actually taken their coins off exchanges and held them in a hardware wallet. And I was told the
Wow.
other day from one of the main hardware makers that the CEO of that company that they've had unusually big surge in sales for hardware wallets, which they don't generally
Wow.
experience during price declines. And so I think that's one of the more bullish catalysts out there that I think that people are kind of seeing the usefulness of Bitcoin as a self-custodial peer-to-peer type of money, even though in the price sense, as a piece of collateral, as a piece of leverage that is getting kind of forced sold in this kind of casino of broad crypto, I think that's the bearish part. But I think the underlying fundamentals that are happening, I still think long term are bullish.
Yes, I agree with you as well on that. And I think a lot of the things you just mentioned, that this we're in a capitulation value zone, I agree with you. As a contrarian, I think you make a lot of sense. And I think given just the social media, pessimism, the absolute fear and panic there, does that also strike you as a kind of a contrary indication? You called it a washout in sentiment as well.
I think so. I think that basically
Mm,
social media is super bearish. If I
mm,
tweet about Bitcoin, there's usually a lot of people that are trashing it, saying it's totally done. There are always pockets of bullishness. I mean, there are a lot of perma bulls in the space that they're constantly trying to call bottoms, and so that's always concerning to see. I kind of want them to stop trying to call bottoms, and so eventually they'll be right, but who knows when they're going to be right. Um, and so I think that sentiment can always get worse. I mean, things can always be
yeah,
worse. Any sort of capitulation can eventually have an even deeper capitulation. So
yes,
I don't think people should take that as a thing saying, okay, it can't go lower. Let's go leverage long, right? That's not what I'm saying. But I do think that we're in a total capitulation type of environment where, smart long-term investors might want to analyze the technology, might want to analyze the market and see if it's something that they're interested in. I certainly am more bullish given a 3 to 5 year view from these price levels than I have been for the past couple years. My contrarian signal is kind of
yeah,
going up here. One way I would
me too.
describe it is, when we have the next rising PMI environment, I would certainly be bullish on Bitcoin. From here till there, I still think we're in kind of a difficult zone where
Yeah,
I think there's a good chance we've seen the worst, but I still think it's going to be a challenging environment for several months. Um, and so, I still think that there are time to build a position or to research your potential positioning. So I would basically give any kind of long-term bullish outlook several years to play out rather than trying to predict too closely what's going to happen in any sort of like 3 month period.
I agree with you. Yeah, and more of a long-term 6 to 12 month outlook. Yes. So you're more optimistic about its long-term, shall we say 12 months, or what do you think? I know it's all speculation a little bit, but what do you feel more, what kind of time frame you're more confident about? Is it 12 to 18 months, 2 years, 3 years? What is that?
So I think the next, like, say, 0 to 12 months is still very difficult to call because I think we're
Hmm.
we're currently still in an economic decelerating environment.
Yeah.
Now, historically, Bitcoin tends to bottom before PMI bottoms, right? So this might have been roughly the bottom, and then you still have economic deceleration because basically what you start to do is then you price in more dovish central bank policy, more liquidity, things like that. So basically, the price bottom in such a volatile asset can precede the bottom of the actual economic situation. Doesn't mean it always has to work like that, but it's something to keep in mind. So I think the next 0 to 6 to 12 months is still very uncertain. Where you could chop along, you could rise
Yeah.
moderately, you could maybe see a lower low, but maybe not as explosive as we've already seen. And then I think that when you have a rising PMI environment, looking out, say in the next 6 to 24 months or 6 to 36 months, I think that's where I'd be more structurally bullish. My highest conviction view is in that kind of multi-year time frame. But I think now is kind of a more interesting phase for watching it, maybe accumulating, while still being cautious and not being shocked if we do see, sideways
Yeah.
action or some maybe lower lows.
Thank you very much, Lynn. By the way, guys, please do check out Lynn's premium newsletter. I think it's definitely worth, taking out the subscription. Please go to lynnalden.com/premium, and you can find out all the details about her premium subscription. And definitely please do subscribe. I think it's really worth it. Can you just explain briefly what people can get in your premium subscription, as well as your free newsletter?
Sure, happy to. So I kind of do 3 types of material on my website. So one is I put out a couple, these long-term pieces that focus on evergreen types of content. So I explore a subject and kind of write about it. The other thing I do is I have a public newsletter that comes out every 6 weeks on average, and that gets a little bit more tactical and time sensitive and focuses on what's happening with markets. What is the macro outlook at this current time? And then that's the majority of my content. But then I have a fairly low cost research service that comes out every 2 weeks, and that's even more tactical. And that's kind of diving into, okay, what's happening in markets across treasuries, gold, credit markets, stock market, global markets, digital assets. What's happening, all these different ecosystems. What's of interest, and then I often dive into a specific company or a specific industry as like an opportunity. And so that's kind of my most frequent level of update, where I'm sharing what I'm investing in, and I'm kind of focusing on all these different things that are happening in the world.
Len, thanks very much. You've been a wonderful guest, and you've been one of the most interesting people I've talked to, certainly in these interviews. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.